The room felt colder the moment she smiled and said, "This was my idea," as if the last 3 years of my life were a footnote. My name is Mark Chen, 38, senior mechanical engineer and lead inventor in our research lab. I lived for the late nights soldering circuits, sketching prototypes on napkins, and running experiments that kept our small team afloat. My weekends blurred into patent drafts and prototype runs, and the people who mattered at work treated me like the quiet backbone who made things actually work. At home, my wife joked that the lab was my second family. I wanted my work to speak for itself until one meeting made it scream a lie. We were in the glass-walled conference room that overlooked a courtyard of cracked pavers and a single, stubborn maple. The projector cast a cold rectangle on the far wall, the schematic glowing in unnatural blue. Fluorescent lights hummed above like indifferent insects. I could feel the hum under the skin of my palms where I had been gripping the edge of the table. The air smelled faintly of reheated coffee and the metallic tang of solder dust that never quite left my clothes. People were clustered around the table, shoulders leaning forward, phones silent for once. I had handed her the slides because I trusted her to be clear and concise. I had thought that handing things over was the easiest way to keep the team calm and let the work take center stage. It was not my habit to crave attention. My satisfaction came from watching a prototype breathe life when power flowed through it the right way, or when a sensor finally stopped misbehaving at 3 in the morning and the graph flattened like a small victory flag. I kept stacks of lab notebooks, margins full of half-formed equations and arrows that only made sense to me. I took joy in the small, private rituals of invention. I rarely spoke up during presentations. I preferred diagrams to talking points. That reticence had been a shield as much as a habit. It let me focus on the things that needed to be done and spared me the performative parts of corporate life that felt like wearing a stiff suit in a sauna. Before the meeting, I had been careful in a way that had become second nature. I had time-stamped prototypes, emailed sketches to myself at odd hours, and left little breadcrumbs in shared folders under versions labeled with dates no one ever noticed. I had thought those breadcrumbs were enough because, in the lab, results usually did the talking. My colleagues, the ones who stayed late and burned their weekends alongside me, treated me with a quiet deference. Managers called me reliable. The new hires learned to come to me with questions about tolerances and thermal drift. I built the thing from the ground up, piece by piece, solder to solder. That kind of work does not happen in a single flash of inspiration. It was a stubborn accumulation of failed runs, corrected tolerances, and a dozen small fixes that one person living in the details could hold together. And yet, standing in that room, listening to the words that turned 3 years of incremental, lonely labor into a neat sentence on her tongue, I felt all that messy, lived work collapse into something fragile. It mattered because those years were not just a line on my resume. They were mortgage payments, a child's preschool fund, the reputation I had quietly built. They were the reason I stayed up until dawn debugging firmware so the rest of the team could test a new motor at noon. They were my currency in a company that rewarded the visible hero and sometimes forgot the people who made the machinery of progress functional. I watched the lines on the schematic on the screen and remembered nights when the same layout had been scrawled on a napkin next to a thermos. I remembered the first prototype that smoked and the way my hands had trembled while I lifted it out of the test rig and jotted notes. Memory has a taste sometimes, like the acrid snap of a burned trace on a circuit board. It hit me then, sharp and private, and made my throat go dry. Around the table people smiled and someone laughed at an aside. I felt distant from the scene as if I were watching a recording of a meeting I had attended years ago. I had hoped that the slow, methodical work of inventing would be its own witness. That hope had been practical as well as philosophical. Patent law, after all, has language about first to file and prior art, but in everyday corporate life recognition comes in the room where people clap. I had learned to take my wins in quiet increments because the loud wins were often not the enduring ones. Still, there was a dignity to being known among peers for the work you actually did. I knew the names of every capacitive sensor we had tried, the reason we had abandoned one motor design, the small tweak in the thermal compensation that had stopped a calibration drift. Those were the things I lived inside. They were the scaffolding of my career, and I had trusted that they would hold when pressure came. Now the scaffolding creaked. I could feel the shift like a draft under a door. My chest tightened not because I planned to yell or make a scene, but because something essential had been misread in public. The cold in the room was not just temperature. It was the sudden absence of warmth that comes from being erased in front of people who mattered. I tried to find the shape of what to do next in the static of my own thoughts, but the answers were not ready. They required paperwork and timelines, and a patience not unlike the kind I put into prototypes. For a few seconds I let myself only watch and listen, storing the expressions on faces and the cadence of that claim, wondering how to translate a private history into proof that would stand up under more than polite applause. She was everything I had hired her to be: organized, quick with scheduling, and able to make a dry slide deck seem human. She had a laugh that folded a room into attention and a way of paraphrasing complex ideas that made engineers and executives both feel smarter. I had trusted her to speak because she could. I believed the work would carry itself. I trusted the person I had trained. Halfway through her run of the slides, she stopped citing data and started spinning narrative. She described the problem as though it had been a personal puzzle she'd solved: how she noticed a thermal anomaly in an earlier prototype, how she reimagined the motor coupling, how she had pushed the whole design into a different class of performance. The phrasing was casual, almost breezy, but what it did to my work was surgical. It stripped the incremental war of knights and burned traces off the story and left a bow on the theory, neatly labeled with her name. The room changed its temperature with her words. Curiosity softened into admiration, admiration into congratulations. A manager leaned forward and patted her shoulder the way people do when they want a performance to be easy and good. Someone in the back chuckled and said, "Kudos, this is a big shift." Phones nudged out of pockets to capture the slide with her name in the header. Faces I'd nodded past morning after morning turned toward her with the same warm focus that had once been for processes and prototypes and quiet problem-solving. They were clapping for a story I recognized as my life. The sound of applause felt thin and unreal to me. My palms were slick with a heat that had nothing to do with the humming lights. My notes, pages of calculations, hand-drawn schematics, timestamps, and apologetic margin notes where I'd jotted fixes at 2 a.m. sitting in a neat stack at my place, suddenly seemed like supporting material for someone else's speech. When the Q&A opened, people directed technical questions her way out of habit. When the VP asked who to recognize for the work, she took the spotlight and smiled like it was her punchline. I felt the color drain from my face as if a tide had pulled out and exposed rawness where pride used to sit. After the meeting, the hallways felt longer, as if everyone had made space around me to avoid a potential scene. Whispering followed me, a low, continuous rustle that sounded like paper-soft questions in the elevator, quiet congratulations for her that stopped dead when I entered a room. One colleague who used to share lunch and the latest firmware hacks with me avoided eye contact, offering a stiff, "Nice job, by the way," then retreating as if proximity to my anger might splatter on him. Another sent an email disguised as small talk: "Great presentation, let's sync later about implementation." It was polite, but the underlying assumption was clear: she had ownership of the idea now. The assistant floated through the next day like someone stepping out of a shower of light. She answered emails with a jaunty confidence and forwarded the presentation deck with a subject line that credited team lead and vision. Someone posted a brief congratulatory note in the company channel saying, "Huge thanks to X for the concept game changer," and the thread filled with emojis. I stared at the message thread longer than I should have, feeling like an extra character in my own life's narrative. In the lab, the machines hummed on, indifferent. The motor test bench continued to cycle through protocols. Capacitive sensors still drifted in their own small ways. That constancy was a small mercy. But the social fabric had a new tier. Meetings that used to begin with a casual "Mark, can you weigh in?" now began with an awkward pause and then a direct question to her. I found myself answering only when asked directly or when a calibration curve needed explaining. I became the backup singer in a band where I had written half the songs. For a few days, I let the shame wash over me like rain. I had 1,000 arguments at my fingertips: my notebooks, prototype photos, version histories, and yet the prospect of confronting her felt like stepping onto a live circuit without insulating gloves. I worried about being cast as petty in open-plan offices and performance reviews read by HR. If I challenged her and lost, what would colleagues conclude? That I was vain, bitter, or worse, someone who couldn't collaborate. If I challenged her and were right, what then? A messy HR investigation, reputational risk, the kind of gossip that sticks. I thought of my mortgage, my kids' preschool, the quiet ways I'd proven my value over years. Could I risk turning that into a courtroom spectacle? So I kept my head down. I answered questions, I calibrated sensors, I stayed late and pulled the same long hours that had always defined me. But I did so with a new awareness. The lab had split into two realities, one where the narrative of authorship had been rewritten on a slide, and another where the truth sat in dog-eared notebooks under a bench light. The dissonance was loud, and it made me clench my jaw at odd times, tasting the metallic tang of betrayal. Friends outside work urged me to say something, file a complaint, demand recognition, talk to legal. I opened my mouth and closed it. I rehearsed words until a pit formed in my stomach, then swallowed them back down. The idea of calling someone dishonest clanged against the sameness of lab safety, the bureaucracy of corporate patents, the messy human cost of accusation. My instinct had always been toward proof, toward evidence that didn't rely on raised voices. So for now, I watched and cataloged and tried to make myself small enough not to ruin my career if I lost, while large enough to remember where I'd put all the important pages. The whispers never really stopped. They softened like a misshapen bruise, never fully gone. And every time I opened my lab notebook and ran my thumb along the margin dates, the handwriting felt both like a map and a warning. I had work to protect, finances to consider, a reputation that mattered. I told myself I would not act rashly, that this was an error a prudent person could correct. But inside, between calibrations and code pushes, something cold and steady began to grow. The morning I found the file, my coffee was still too hot to drink. It was a routine sweep through the team's shared drive, something I do when I'm checking version histories, making sure no one has accidentally overwritten a test script. I clicked on a folder she'd been curating, and there it was. The presentation deck from the week before, one I'd handed her with margin notes in my handwriting, but the title slide bore her name in neat sans serif, and below it, in a smaller font like an afterthought, Draft Patent 2024 XXXX. My stomach tightened as if someone had grabbed it and twisted. I opened the slide where she'd narrated the thermal anomaly, my thermocouple log pasted there, my sketch of the coupling with the hand-ruled tolerances that kept it from seizing. Someone had lifted my diagrams, cropped out my margin notes, and placed them into a narrative that read like an origin story. The title slide looked like a claim. The draft patent number made it concrete. It meant she'd taken the step toward official ownership. If the number was legit, it would be evidence you could stamp and send to legal and HR. If it wasn't, it still had power. It was the kind of thing people repeat until everyone believes it. Rage came first, short, hot, instinctive, then, oddly, a calm that felt colder and more dangerous. Anger had no use in a corridor of fluorescent lights and floor-to-ceiling glass. I could imagine the scene if I stormed in, raised voices, a manager's awkward shuffle, gossip that would outlive the facts. I had a family. I had a career built over decades of small, steady increments. A scene could cost me all of that, but doing nothing was worse. If I let her narrative ossify into accepted fact, future contracts, bonuses, and the patent itself would follow. The work would be legally recast as hers. Confrontation offered no guarantee and plenty of downside. Bring it up and I risked being labeled petty or bitter. People sympathize with the person who loses because of malice. They admire the person who loses because they were too trusting. I remembered one of my grad advisors, only record what you want to defend. He'd been blunt about the bureaucracy of intellectual property. Evidence matters more than eloquence. The law doesn't care about who tells a better story in a room. It cares about paper, priority, and timestamps. It took me a few long, coffeeless minutes to let the anger crystallize into strategy. The path forward wasn't litigation or public humiliation. It was documentation, vertical, legal, immovable documentation. If I could create or secure a record with an unambiguous timestamp that placed the invention before her claimed filing, the story would stop being a matter of who spoke louder and start being a matter of who filed first. I knew enough of patent process to know first to file would favor whoever could show the earliest verified date, and that provisional filings and properly notarized lab notebooks can be decisive. I thought in the language of my work: timestamps, checksums, and chains of custody. I thought of the early photographs of prototypes taken with my phone, the firmware commits in the repo with my initials, the scrawled equations in the lab notebook scratched across 3 nights at 2 a.m. These weren't just paper and pixels, they were a timeline of thought. They could be stitched together to make a narrative that matched what I knew to be true, but assembling the evidence required care. If I drew attention to myself now, if I started pulling things out or asking pointed questions, alarm bells would ring. She was already the center of a small orbit. Any sudden motion could send debris scattering in ways that harmed me. The plan had to be quiet, methodical, almost bureaucratic in its patience. Collect first, reveal later, let the acclaim come, let her take the next meeting. People would keep applauding the polished version of the story. Then, when the record was airtight, drop a single, irrefutable paper that reset the timeline. I pictured the logistics, preserving every manifest copy of the design files, exporting metadata from our version control, photographing prototype serial numbers under chain of custody conditions, digitally timestamping key documents. I would need witness statements from the few people who had been in the lab when I first assembled the coupling. I would need to ensure backup copies existed off-network and that access logs couldn't be tampered with. None of it felt theatrical. It felt like wearing gloves and fastening a harness before climbing a face of rock, practical steps that made the danger manageable. This was not about revenge. I said that to myself like a mantra because the difference matters. Revenge is a hot thing, a spectacle meant to hurt. What I wanted was protection for the work, for the team that depended on the project, for the future designs that would flow from this one. If the company lost the patent because of a misunderstanding or a lie, the consequences would ripple far beyond my bruised ego. We had investors who were counting on this line of products. Junior engineers whose careers would be shaped by recognition. I kept returning to the same simple, stubborn fact. The only thing that would silence the whispers and make the right thing legally true was an undeniable legal record. So I resolved to build that record, quietly, methodically. I closed the deck, copied my own notes to a new folder, and ran a checksum on the files I thought mattered. I made a list: lab notebooks, file commits, prototype serial photos, witness names. I wrote it in the margin of my own notebook like an equation I intended to solve. Then I sat for a long time and let the plan arrange itself into steps I could do without drama. The next moves would be legal and technical and, if necessary, tedious. They would be invisible to people who were busy celebrating. Let her have the moment, I told myself. Let the applause swell. I would not interrupt the narrative mid-song. But I would make sure there was a transcript, dated, notarized, and impossible to erase, waiting for the silence after the music stopped. I hired a patent attorney the next week. Her name was Leela, and she had an office in a building 2 blocks from the lab, one of those places with frosted glass and a receptionist who knew how to keep things discreet. We met on a rain-slick Tuesday after I closed up the lab, my jacket still smelling faintly of solder and solvent. I brought battered lab notebooks, a stack of annotated printouts, a thumb drive of firmware commits, and a list of names of the people who had been in the room when I first assembled the coupling. Leela listened without surprise, then explained the quiet math of priority filings and provisional applications. She asked me the kind of questions that exposed gaps I had not known I had. When she left the next morning, I had a checklist printed on her letterhead and a firm plan to convert my clutter into a legal scaffold. Nights became an exercise in careful conversion. I sat under the desk lamp that had watched me sketch parts for more than a decade, and I transcribed hand-drawn tolerances into typed affidavits. I scanned pages of my lab notebook at 600 dpi and made sure the scanner embedded time metadata. I photographed prototypes with my phone next to a dated newspaper for extra proof, and then uploaded those images to a read-only archive in a cloud account that only Leela and I could access. I exported commit logs from the repository and ran scripts to calculate checksums, then wrote down the commands I used so nothing could be claimed to be tampered with later. I woke at dawn the morning I filed the provisional application. There is a particular kind of silence at 6 a.m. that holds the world like breath. Leela walked me through the submission, double-checking descriptions and the claim language I had forced myself to refine into a form that legal eyes could understand. The provisional does not grant a patent, but it does establish priority. Filing it felt like clicking a lock into place. When the confirmation arrived, it came to Leela's inbox, time-stamped and official, and she agreed to forward it to me at a specific minute we had chosen for the meeting day. The timing was surgical. It tightened the hinge between the public applause I would allow and the private paper that would open the door. Compartmentalization was its own art. At work I drank the same coffee, kept my office lights on the same hours, and joined the same casual conversations around the prototype table. I let the assistant rehearse her presentation, watched her practice in front of peers, and even gave her a few coaching tips on cadence I knew would make an audience lean forward. People assumed I was giving moral support. That misdirection felt strange, like patting a coiled rope that would later bind. The fewer ripples I made in the pond, the better. If I changed my routines too much or started asking colleagues about their memories of specific dates, someone would ask questions. The safest tactic was to be boring. Behind the calm, though, I was making sure there would be no way to rewrite history. I backed up every original file to multiple locations, each with a documented chain of custody. One copy went to an encrypted drive in my home safe, another to Leela's firm, and a third to the archiving service we used for customer reports. I changed access permissions on the team repository to read-only for the relevant branches and documented those permission changes with screenshots and logs. I took forensic images of prototype firmware and stored the device serial numbers along with time-stamped photographs of the components installed in the coupling. For the physical notebooks, I purchased a tamper-evident envelope, sealed the original pages, and had them notarized. It felt excessive, and maybe it was, but legal battles are won by paper and patience, not by righteous speeches. I also lined up witnesses without making them feel like part of a conspiracy. I asked one senior tech who had been on the late-night bench with me if she would jot a quick note about dates and what she remembered. I did not frame it as a complaint. I framed it as a professional habit I was instituting after a messy IP situation at another company. Another graduate intern agreed to sign an affidavit that she had seen the initial assembly on a specific night. These statements were simple and factual, not emotional. Leela notarized them and stored them with the other evidence. Each person signed as though they were helping with routine documentation. That normalcy was crucial. There were mundane security steps too. I audited the lab's network logs and printed the relevant entries. I set up an alert on my personal email to notify me if any of the files I cared about were accessed. I disabled Cloud Sync on my workstation for the projects we were protecting so no accidental overwrite could occur from some exuberant sync. I labeled the original prototypes with a small, nearly invisible marker that only I and Leela would recognize as confirmation of provenance. These were small things easily overlooked by anyone not looking for them. Maintaining distance was the hardest part. I smiled at her rehearsals, offered the occasional technical clarifying point, and watched colleagues clap when she hit a line of explanation with practiced charm. Sometimes I felt like an actor in a play I had written but was now watching someone else perform. Sleep came in fragments. I relived conversations, worried about the oddity of leaving certain items inaccessible, and double-checked my cloud backups at 3 a.m. When I called Leela, my voice was calmer than I felt, and she reminded me to let the team assume success for now. That was the plan in a sentence. Let the moment happen, then produce the paper that would reset who had actually built it. Every detail was a silent stitch. I made lists, checked them twice, and filed confirmations where they could not be dismissed. The work felt surgical and oddly intimate, like cataloging the bones of an argument so that when it was time, the skeleton could not be reinvented. I kept my face neutral in meetings, my hands immobile while applause swelled and my inbox free of curiosity. The reveal would be a single, small thing dropped into the room that would change the narrative. For now, I sewed the seams and waited for the proper moment to cut them open. She presented like she had rehearsed for the role of a lifetime. Her voice cut through the fluorescent hum, confident and warm, and people leaned in the way only an audience does when it is about to crown a favorite. A senior manager laughed at one of her jokes and mentioned a bonus in passing as if the company had already decided how to reward a hero. I let it happen. I watched her collect that light, watched colleagues smile and nod, watched the applause begin to rise like water toward a lip. I waited until the applause had almost finished. My body felt strangely detached from the room, like I was watching an old film of myself. The plan we had rehearsed in the quiet hours unwound into the present without a hitch. I had planned my movement to be as unremarkable as possible. I pushed my chair back, stood, and asked for a moment to add a brief clarification. My voice was calm, the kind of voice you use when you are delivering technical corrections at a peer review. No one expected the minutes that followed to feel like a verdict. Leela had told me to keep it succinct and factual. She was on her phone in the front row, one thumb poised over a message thread, ready to forward the confirmation to me at the exact moment she had promised. Her message arrived as a small ping in my pocket, privileged and precise. I felt the weight of it like a coin in my palm. I drew a printed copy from my folder, the paper still cool from the printer, and I set it on the table without fanfare. The header was the filing confirmation, neat and official, with a timestamp. I did not need to shine a light on it, the room did that for me. I explained slowly the legal reality that I had established. The provisional application had been submitted 2 days earlier under my name, I said, and patent law recognizes first to file when supporting documentation corroborates authorship. I tapped the printed confirmation with one fingertip and then laid out the next pieces like cards in a measured hand. Notarized pages from my lab notebook, screenshots of commit logs with checksums, photographs of prototypes set next to a dated newspaper, affidavits from colleagues who had been in the room when the initial assembly was done. Each item was described in plain language, without rancor. I used terms managers understood, not the locked jargon of legal arguments. Evidence, date, chain of custody, priority. I could feel the room changing. The air that had been celebratory now had a current running through it, small at first, then widening into a full stop. Someone's laughter trailed off. The senior manager who had promised a bonus blinked, the surety folding into something like calculation. My voice did not tremble. I had rehearsed the cadence the same way I had rehearsed a presentation, and that discipline paid off. When I said the word provisional, people heard it as if it was the name of an arbiter. When I mentioned notarized evidence, they heard wait. She scrambled for words. The pitch of her voice rose in a way that was not theatrical but raw. She said that she had submitted a draft, that she had been working on the narrative, that the codebase had been collaborative. Those were ordinary defenses, the ones people use when surprised in a field where authorship is messy and messy is common. But she could not produce earlier timestamps. The files she showed the week before had been edited in ways that did not carry the signatures of origin my evidence bore. She reached for emails and drafts on her laptop and found that the care I had taken to lock down the repository and to archive originals left her with versions that either postdated my submission or lacked records strong enough to counter mine. I walked them through the chain of custody with the patience of someone explaining a mechanism you can see and touch. The notarized envelope, for example, had been opened in front of the room by a company attorney in a previous case they all knew about. That detail landed. The commit checksums matched the files on the prototype device. The dated photographs matched serial numbers. Each small consistency tightened the frame around what she could claim. It was not an emotional takedown. It was a technical showing, and in a room of engineers and managers, the technical showing is often final. People leaned forward now, not to applaud but to read. A junior engineer whispered to her neighbor. The HR director, who had been chatting at the back, lifted a hand to her chin and spoke into a tablet. Someone at legal stood, mouth set, and walked toward the table with a notebook. I watched faces change color as facts rearranged loyalty. The woman who had been smiling a moment before looked sidelong at me, then down at the documents. Her composure cracked into thin, panicked motions. She opened her mouth to speak and closed it again. The words she offered were smaller, defensive, explanations trimmed of the bravado she had deployed earlier. I did not gloat. There was no need. My evidence was not a show of anger but of precision. When I finished, I folded my hands on the table and let the room calibrate itself. Someone asked a question about claim language and I answered, because it mattered that the narrative be accurate and not overheated. Managers who had been quick to congratulate her now asked HR and legal to examine the documents on the spot. Phones came out not for applause but for notes. The hum of the projector seemed to dull. The applause that had begun to rise evaporated. Her face became a study in sudden loss. The lights, which had seemed to favor her in the earlier part of the presentation, now found the rawness of her expression. It went white. The days that followed felt both public and utterly lonely. HR opened an investigation that moved with the precise, indifferent speed of bureaucracy. They took statements, cataloged evidence, and asked me to repeat the timeline until it was a series of neat, numbered points. At times I felt like a witness in my own life, watching myself describe meetings and file transfers with the clarity of someone reading from a script. Depositions were scheduled. A corporate attorney asked me the same question 3 different ways to see if my answers held. I answered each time with the same facts and the same small calm I had used in the presentation. My proof did not care about tone. It cared about dates, seals, and checksums. She was suspended pending review. The word felt final even before the paperwork arrived. Colleagues who had been quick to clap for her now avoided my eyes in the hallways. Some sidestepped me as if proximity might smudge some record I had produced. That quiet avoidance cut in a way the courtroom formalities did not. People I had eaten pizza with at midnight, the ones who had joked about solder burns and deadlines, now kept their distance. A couple of them offered awkward apologies that sounded like rehearsed lines. A few, I learned later, had been pressured between loyalty to a friend and the instinct to stand with the person who had produced the evidence. The lab felt smaller. Conversations contracted into emails and scheduled meetings. The casual trust that had lubricated late-night fixes and quick runs to the parts store was gone. Recognition came in the form of a memo. Legal confirmed that the company would proceed with patent prosecution in my name, and a manager sent a perfunctory congratulations that read more like a legal formality than a celebration. I filed the provisional into the company process and met with legal to outline claim language and prior art. The thrill of vindication was there in the margins, but it was overlaid with fatigue. I had wanted my work to be respected for its merits, and in that respect I had been restored. But I did not get the scene I had imagined for so many late nights, the kind where colleagues understood and honored the messy process of invention without a separate fight. I had to narrate the betrayal in interviews and in deposition rooms where my words were recorded and replayed. Each time I described the moment, she took the stage with slides labeled as hers. I felt the old ache flare. Telling the story was necessary. It fed the legal record. Telling it again and again made it feel practiced. At certain hours I woke and remembered the way light had fallen on her face as the room applauded, and the memory hurt more than any line of cross-examination. Revenge had been a precise instrument, but even precision cannot erase what was stolen for those moments. The outcome also carried human consequences that settled like dust on everything. Some people argued that I had been cold in how I handled it. A couple of managers suggested we could have handled the accusation more discreetly. There was no easy answer. If I had confronted her privately, the record might have stayed murky. If I had let it go, the patent might have been filed without my name, and my years of work would have been footnotes to someone else's career. The choice I made protected the intellectual property I had built, but it also altered the social architecture of the lab. I could see the ripple effects in project teams that now instituted formal authorship logs, in access controls tightened around repositories, in the way new ideas were introduced with an accompanying packet of proof. There were unexpected kindnesses. Leela, who had quietly coached me through the hearing, sent a message that read less like law and more like friendship. My wife took me out of the office for a long walk and reminded me that I was more than a name on a filing. A junior engineer who had been in the room slipped a note under my door thanking me for protecting the integrity of the work and admitting embarrassment for not noticing sooner. Those small human things mattered, but they did not erase the sense that something informal and irreplaceable had been lost. I learned practical lessons the hard way. I learned to make timestamps indisputable, to notarize when possible, to record and back up with a chain of custody in mind. I taught the team to treat ideas like artifacts that require protection, not just inspiration that floats between people. I learned to trust documents and actions more than smooth words and clever presentations. That lesson came with a cost because it meant a quieter way of working, fewer impromptu collaborations, and a vigilance that wedges itself into the rhythm of day-to-day life. In quieter moments, I replayed the ethics of my choice and felt complex pride mixed with lingering sorrow. I had not sought to humiliate anyone, but I had not flinched from defending what was mine. The relief of being vindicated did not erase the sting of betrayal, and it did not restore the trust I once placed so freely. What it did teach me was blunt and useful. Always document, protect your work early, and trust actions more than words. Quiet, careful preparation is the most effective way to take back what is yours.